Celeste Carruthers, she is the William F. Fox Distinguished Professor of Labor Economics in the College of Business at the University of Tennessee. She is jointly appointed with their Department of Economics and the Boyd Center of Business and Economic Research. Her work is primarily interested in a variety of education policy arenas. Today, we've asked her to speak to us specifically on the question of community colleges and their role in PK through 16 educational systems. Community colleges are obviously an integral part of the higher education landscape and an underserved and under investigated part of the higher education landscape. So I'm just absolutely excited that Celeste is bringing her skills and talents to this particular question. But they're also an increasingly important part of the K-12 educational landscape, as nearly 20% of the enrollments in community colleges are dual enrollments with high school students pursuing dual credit degrees of some sort. So this is becoming a point of connection and a nexus between the K-12 system and the higher education pipeline. This is an increasingly important point of access for first-generation students, students of color, low SES students, and that's exactly why Celeste is exactly in this space, doing work that helps us understand what's going on. So will you please join me in welcoming Celeste Carruthers.
Thank you so much to Lori, and thank you to Kalena and everyone at the Bush School and in College Station that has been so welcoming. I've had a terrific visit, and I'm just so honored by the invitation to give this talk for the Mosbacher Institute here at Texas A&M. And I really look forward to hearing your perspective, your feedback, your kind of comments and questions on a topic that has been very important to me for a very long time. I'd like to grapple with a really big and important question about community colleges. And if you're here by accident, community colleges are 2-year, publicly funded, publicly operated, managed higher education institutions that award kind of degrees and help students transfer to other institutions and kind of help them transition between industries, between jobs. They serve a lot of different roles. And so the big, difficult question that I'm asking is, can community colleges be all things to all students? Can they serve all of these roles effectively? And before we kind of start to tackle that question, I want to walk through 4 parts of the premise of that question, that community colleges are trying to be all things to all students. So the first part of that premise, I want to make the case that community colleges serve every kind of learner. They serve every kind of student. Community colleges enroll brand new high school graduates who are kind of seeking higher degrees, something higher than a high school diploma. They also serve older students who are going back to school or who are enrolling in college for the first time. Pictured, you see a woman and a young man. They are mother and son graduating at the same time from Pellissippi State Community College. When my husband and I moved from Gainesville, Florida to Knoxville, Tennessee, we learned very quickly that his skills in fiber optic network installation were not in demand in Tennessee. Now, 14 years later, Knoxville is just starting to get serious about fiber. And so what he did was he enrolled in Pellissippi State Community College in a video production technology program. He kind of completed that program and got a job in the field, editing and media management for a small production company in Knoxville. So community colleges enroll people like my husband. They enroll displaced workers who have lost their job or who have become kind of underemployed and want to learn something new, want to do something new. And as Lori mentioned, they increasingly enroll a lot of dual enrolled high school students who are getting secondary and post-secondary credit at the same time. Community colleges enroll students with disabilities. They enroll students who are there purely just for fun, who are taking a fishing class for non-credit or taking another type of hobby-style class. They enroll students who have a bunch of different end goals in mind, maybe a terminal certificate, maybe some skills in fly fishing, or a degree or transfer to another institution. They enroll students with completely different kind of education experiences in mind, students who want an academic education or students who want a more kind of applied, practical, career-focused education. So the second part of the premise that community colleges serve, that they try to serve all students in a different way, is that community college enrollment tends to be more tightly linked to jobs and economic fluctuations than four-year university enrollment. So they don't have kind of admissions offices that are strategizing around how many students they're going to admit in a particular year as part of some kind of long-term selectivity strategy. Community colleges kind of serve the top 100% of students, and so it's kind of not part of the equation. So what does drive enrollment fluctuations from one year to the next? It's oftentimes some aspect of economic fluctuations and the labor market, because what's happening in the labor market can be a substitute to kind of enrolling in a community college with the intention of kind of getting labor-ready skills down the road. So this figure is from a report that my co-author Bill Fox and Bryce Warden and I put together in 2020. This was in summer 2020. That context is important for where this report came from. And it's just depicting counter-cyclical community college enrollment in Tennessee. So the gray shaded bars depict the last two recessions prior to the very brief COVID recession, where we saw an uptick in community college enrollment, which is depicted by the dashed line in the center of the two trends, below the four-year college enrollment and above TCAT enrollment, which is another public higher ed institution in Tennessee that I'll say more about shortly. So this project this report grew out of a kind of urgent interest in summer 2020 to try to advise state policymakers about what could happen in higher education in the wake of the COVID pandemic and the ensuing kind of lockdown restrictions and the short recession that we were just then climbing out of, although we didn't quite know it at the time. And our concern was that in previous recessions, state revenue had really been crunched and enrollment had boomed. And so that's kind of a bad equation if all of that happens again in a fast sequence. It's actually not what happened at all. Like if you kind of follow enrollment trends and news about community colleges, you know that in fall 2020, community college enrollment fell off a lot. So if we extend these trends out a bit further off the edge of the graph, you would see community college enrollment drop. So here I've extended that for you. This is from a Tennessee Board of Regents data dashboard, and of showing the total enrollment headcount in blue, the taller bars, and the full-time equivalent enrollment headcount in community colleges in red, the shorter bars. And the last three trends in that series you can see have significantly lower enrollment beginning with fall 2020. Enrollment fell again in fall 21, and then fell again in fall 22. This is not just a Tennessee phenomenon. Nationwide, there are about 1 million fewer students enrolled in community colleges than before the pandemic. You can see that in the second from the top trend, the kind of more downward sloping of all the other trends there. And I neglected to put the text box with the source up here, but this is from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center's current term enrollment estimates, which is definitely a series that you should follow if you want to kind of learn more about what this looks like nationally and how it breaks down by age, by demographics, by sector, 2-year, 4-year, and so on. So what might be happening in this most recent drop-off in community college enrollment? As I've alluded to earlier, I suspect that the labor market has something to do with it. So our COVID recession might have seen more students enrolling in community colleges, but the COVID recession was so short that it was over and we were in the expansion phase when students went back to school in fall 2020. And by fall 2020, jobs were actually just rocketing and increasing to such an extent that worker shortages were forcing employees to raise pay, to make job openings available to more and more individuals. Private companies in the Knoxville area were recruiting directly from high schools. This is a news story about Malibu Boats, who was recruiting new workers directly from high school. This is a Burger King in Knoxville that was offering a $1,200 sign-on bonus for new employees, just absolutely unheard of a few years ago. Big retailers were paying $24 an hour and more in some markets to try to recruit more workers. And employers are also dropping education requirements in both the private sector and the public sector. So a lot of jobs for which the price of entry previously had to be some kind of college credential. We're kind of wiping that off the books and saying that you could use prior experience or kind of other types of credentials to obtain these jobs. So, with about twice as many job openings as job seekers in Tennessee and the U.S., this is a pattern that's kind of continuing a bit off the edge of the graph here with the latest labor market data. It's kind of sensible that community colleges are really competing with a very, very extraordinarily tight labor market for students. Third part of this premise is that community college student outcomes, I'm sorry to say, compare very unfavorably with four-year colleges and universities. And I acknowledge that this is a bit of an apples to pears type of comparison because four-year colleges attract very different students. They get students with completely different resources and constraints on their time and their assets. But nevertheless, when we try to harmonize important outcomes like graduation rates and student loan default rates, the statistics do not look very good for community colleges and community college students if you want these institutions and students to thrive. So the likelihood that a student at a community college will graduate within 3 years from their first institution is about 29%. Oh, but we know a lot of students want to transfer, and so maybe they do that without attaining an associate's degree. But the transfer rate's only about 31%. 12% of community college entrants default on their student loans within just 3 years of entering repayment, which is significantly more than the 5% default rate for four-year enrollees. Turning to earnings, we also know that students with community college credentials on average also earn quite a lot less than students with four-year bachelor's degrees. So this is from another report with some of my colleagues at the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research. And it's on a different kind of big and difficult question that we were asked to think about. Specifically, is college worth it in this environment with labor market shortages and wages increasing and job opportunities increasing for workers without college and education requirements getting kind of wiped off the job postings? Is college worth it? And we took on this question in a number of different ways. The report's kind of on my site and other places. And one way that we took on this question was by using the latest available census data from the current population survey, which was current through fall 22 when we were writing this, and just comparing the earnings in 2022 dollars of workers with different levels of education. And so this figure is depicting kind of the income gap, so the additional earnings that workers with a bachelor's degree, that's in the top kind of solid line, have over workers with no more than a high school diploma. And then much lower than that, we're showing the additional earnings that a worker with an associate's degree has over someone with just a high school diploma by age from 18 to 64. And then below that in the dashed line, the additional earnings that someone with some college but no degree has on average in the US among a representative sample of workers in fall 22 by age over someone with just a high school diploma. And so there are a few different important insights to glean kind of from this figure. One, it's part of the case that we ended up making in this report that college is still very much worth it on average, likely, if we just treat this as a simple financial exercise, even before considering all the non-financial benefits of college. If we're just treating this as an investment in yourself, attaining a bachelor's degree yields significantly higher earnings that increase over the course of a career. So students who are looking at these $24 an hour entry-level jobs might be making a short-term gain, long-term loss type of trade-off if they take those jobs rather than going to college. So that was one insight that came out of this report. If you take the present value of all of the additional earnings that you get with a bachelor's degree on average, it's worth lifetime about $1.5 million is what we estimate, and that's similar to what others have estimated using similar results. So the second important insight to glean from this figure is those additional lifetime earnings are quite a lot less with an associate's degree, kind of depicted by the middle line. They were more like $334,000 or $375,000 in the report. And that's pretty close to the additional earnings that someone without a college degree but some college would have experienced, about $224,000. $100,000. So bear with me as I belabor the investment analogy a little bit further, because yeah, students with a community college degree, they do get lower earnings on average, but they also spend less time in college and they can go to college at much lower cost. That's the big benefit of going to a community college. So kind of following on and replicating earlier work from before the pandemic by others, we estimated the return on investment as if this were a financial instrument with large upfront costs of time, tuition, and money, with some kind of long-term kind of payoff in terms of higher earnings. And we found that there was about a 14.5% estimated rate of return to a bachelor's degree, and that's kind of depicted in the solid black line, and that's held pretty steady in recent years. But the estimated return on an associate's degree in kind of the orange line with square markers has been kind of falling in recent years, and so has the estimated return on investment to attending college and not completing a degree. And remember, higher share of community college enrollees don't complete degrees, and so they would kind of also fall in this kind of dashed line, the some college, no degree category. So is a 6 to 9% return, is that small, is that large? Well, like historically, the real return on things like stocks and bonds are like 3 to 7%. And so it's kind of a silly thought experiment to think of kind of investing what you would spend in college tuition and all of the living expenses that go with that rather than going to work, into stocks and bonds. But it is a kind of useful comparison to kind of track how the earnings returns to different levels of education compare to their costs over time. And what we're finding here is that the kind of ROI for going to a community college and completing an associate's degree has been declining in recent years. Although I will say that this, the sample that resulted in this figure was limited to full-time workers, and if we expand to include part-time workers or workers who go through spells of unemployment, all of whom, having a college degree, even an associate's degree, is, lowers your likelihood of working part-time or going through spells of unemployment, the estimated return looks better. It's significantly over 10% for associate's degree holders too. Okay, but an associate's degree is one path to that kind of higher paying bachelor's degree. Well, the news is very kind of difficult there too, because the community college to university transfer route is particularly fraught. So nationally, CCRC estimates that about 80%, 4 in 5 of new community college students aspire to earn a bachelor's degree. That's what they ultimately want to do. But only 31% even transfer towards that goal, and a smaller share will eventually complete a BA, BS. So in Tennessee, we put together this fact sheet a few years ago. It's on our Tennessee Pearl website, which is a collaborative effort between the Tennessee Higher Ed Commission, Vanderbilt University, and University of Tennessee to study different topics of mutual interest in the higher education area, transfer being one of them. And in Tennessee, we found that the 2 to 4 transfer students were about 16 percentage points less likely to complete a BA, BS. And that's depicted here in the figure. Among all first-time freshmen, students who were first in 4-year school, were about 57% likely to complete a BA, BS within 6 years in these cohorts, which is earlier than kind of the cohorts who are finishing up right now. 41% of 2 to 4 year transfer students were completed a bachelor's degree within 6 years. And those are the students who had completed the transfer to begin with. And remember, CCRC says that only describes like 31% of new community college entrants. This gap was also evident for first-generation students, for Black students, for other racial and or students with multiple racial identities and other non-white identities, and also for white students. So these are descriptive results, the CCRC results as well as our fact sheet results. In more causal research, Mountjoy has a recent article in the American Economic Review where he empirically parses out the earnings return to enrolling in a community college for a couple different types of students. Students who enroll in a community college who otherwise would not have gone to college at all. And he finds that for those students, access to community colleges, so students for whom a community college democratizes their access to college at all, benefit from that access. They're more likely to complete degrees, and they have higher earnings, significantly higher by age 30, about 18%. But students who started a two-year college because they live a little bit closer to a two-year college than a four-year college, and they would have otherwise started a four-year college, they have lower educational attainment ultimately and kind of insignificantly different earnings. Finally, we have to note that all of these outcomes may in part be because community colleges have a lot less in resources that is available to spend on students and support these outcomes that we're interested in. So I pulled these spending data from IPEDS recently, and every account, instructional spending per FTE per full-time equivalent student, strongly favors four-year public colleges and universities. Research spending is almost non-existent in community colleges, so there's not even a kind of lighter purple bar to correspond with two-year schools there. But every other account significantly favors four-year schools. So there's less academic support spending per student in community colleges. There's less institutional support spending, less public service spending, and less student service spending. But the academic support spending gap here is particularly concerning because community college students are probably going to need even more advising to help them navigate complicated transfer routes. So, stylized facts like this have led to two competing views of community college that was articulated well in a recent kind of Heckinger article, which I'll read this middle paragraph. Advocates for community colleges defend them as the underdogs of America's higher education system, left to serve the students who need the most support, but without the money required to provide it. Critics contend that this has become an excuse for poor success rates that are only getting worse, and for the kind of faceless bureaucracies that ultimately prompted the student who they have interviewed to drop out after 2 semesters. Okay, so that was a long way around to get back to the question. So can community colleges truly be of all things to all students? These are a lot of different diverse and competing roles to act in with less resources to do it. And I don't have an answer for this. I wish I had come prepared with an answer that we could all act on immediately, but I think it's a big and difficult question and will take lots of big and sharp minds to think on. So I'm hopeful that what I can do is I can speak across some different research on community colleges by myself and by others on these different functions, some of these different functions that they serve, and highlight some areas where we need to know more. But in general, we need to know more about this question. And so this is a call for more work and more thinking on community colleges and how they can be something other than the underdogs of higher education. So here's a wall of text with all of the citations that I'll mention. Don't worry, we've already gone through some of them and we're not going to return to them. Some of these are more descriptive, or they're policy briefs that are kind of outputs of my joint appointment in a research center. So I have a tenure track line, and through that tenure track line, I write academic articles and I get them into economic journals. And as an economist and kind of the education policy field, I place a high value on credible causal inferences in that type of research. And so they end up being kind of very long papers with appendices and lots of robustness checks and lots of discussion about identification assumptions and internal validity of kind of the results that we're getting. Some of those are in here, and they take a long time. They take many years to write. One of these, the What Knox Achieved paper here, second from last, started as a different paper back in, I think, 2010. And so these are long-lived projects. And policymakers and kind of advocates in this area and others who are interested in these topics, they want to see results and they want to see insights faster than 10, 12 years. And through the Boyd Center, I also have the great privilege of kind of putting together kind of quicker thoughts and quicker pieces that often tend to just be kind of descriptive analyses. And we're very upfront about them being more descriptive reports. So what I'll do is I'll touch on a few of them, both past, present, and future, and then we'll kind of open it up for your questions. But first, let's run through a little bit more of a statistical profile of community colleges. So it's a big sector. They enroll like 4.5 million students, a little bit half of what the public four-year sector is enrolling these days. And it is a lower revenue, lower cost sector. So you can attend a community college. The net cost of attendance, which is tuition plus fees plus other costs of going to college plus your necessary living expenses minus typical financial aid, comes out to about $8,000 a year full-time versus $13,500 in public 4 years and more in for-profit institutions and private four-year schools. The tuition and fees by itself is low enough that this has allowed a number of different states and local areas to introduce these tuition-free community college programs, one of which I'll say a bit more about shortly. And if they structure these programs as what's called like a last dollar program, then they can rely on existing sources of financial aid, like Pell Grants for low-income students that kind of cover these tuition and fees outright. And then the kind of last dollar program will provide other mentoring support and general encouragement about getting into college. So here's a quick summary of some college student characteristics by sector and the kind of most recently available IPEDS data. And a couple things that stand out is that the percent of students who are enrolled full-time is much lower in public two-year schools, 34%, versus the four-year schools and even the for-profit schools. The rate of students who are over 25 is also a lot higher in two-year schools than in the four-year schools, but not as high as it is in for-profit schools. There are slightly more females in attending two-year schools than four-year schools, not as much as in for-profits, interestingly, and a lower rate of international students. Turning to kind of college student demographics, public two-year schools are somewhat less white than four-year schools and not less than for-profit schools, and they enroll relatively more Hispanic students than those other institutions. Community college students are also much more likely to work while they are enrolled. Remember, only like 34% were enrolling full-time. That's because many of them also need to work to sustain their living expenses because they have families, because they have competing responsibilities that necessitate work while they're going to college. So you can't quite see the y-axis here, but the top figure is depicting the rate of working while enrolled in four-year universities in Tennessee. This is from a recent article with Walt Ecton and Carolyn Heinrich and I over time, and it's fluctuated between 40 and 50% in four-year universities in Tennessee. The bottom figure is depicting the rate of working while enrolled in community colleges in Tennessee, and that's closer to 60% and rising in recent years. The other pattern that's evident from this figure is that four-year university students have a more seasonal work pattern. So they're much more likely to work in the summer months than in the fall and spring standard semester months. And those fluctuations are not nearly as evident in community colleges. And that's because community college enrollment is itself more of a spread out more throughout the 12-month calendar, and so is working while enrolled. All right, so with that statistical profile in mind, I'll turn to the first study that I wanted to say a few words on. And this is related to the function that has become more prominent in community colleges in recent years, which is teaching high school students. So helping high school students attain college credit. And I'll show a few results and kind of describe the background behind a short policy brief that I wrote for the Career and Technical Education Research Exchange in 2019 called Career and Technical Education Accountability and Program Quality Indicators under Perkins 5. So here's where the background of that came from. Aside from doing higher education research, I also spend a lot of time thinking about career and technical education research in high schools. CTE evolved in the US from so-called shop class a long, long time ago. It's not called vocational education anymore. CTE in the US is, in most states, is divided into 16 career clusters that encompass every occupation that someone could have. Maybe there might be a few small exceptions, I haven't found one yet. Almost every occupation that someone could have is represented in a career and technical education cluster in a US high school, including those that require college, including those that are more kind of service oriented. And in Tennessee, career and technical education is really, really big. About 45% of students, depending on the year, 40 to 45% of students graduate high school with a CTE concentration, meaning that they have taken, again, depending on the accountability regime, 2 or 3 kind of sequenced career tech ed courses in the same program of study. And I mentioned accountability regime because that's in part where this research brief came from. CTE is kind of regulated in part by a federal law called Perkins, and when Perkins was reauthorized recently, sort of like another broader K-12 accountability reauthorization, ESSER, it was shifted in such a way that districts and states had a little bit more discretion in the types of information that they were reporting to kind of the federal regulators in this space. So there are some things that they have to report, some program quality indicators that they must report, but they have the option to choose among 3 additional state-selected program quality indicators. So each state needed to decide if it was going to report the percent of CTE concentrators who earned a college credential before graduating high school. So that's an indicator of program quality, that they got a 2-for-1, high school and college degree before finishing high school. That was one option. Option 2 was reporting the percent of CTE concentrators who earned college credit before graduating high school. And option 3 was reporting the percent who engaged in work-based learning before graduating high school. And in Tennessee, the state kind of farmed out a little bit of the thinking about those 3 program quality indicators, and I offered to write up some thoughts on the kind of post-secondary certificate, the post-secondary credential indicator. And so that was the premise behind where this came from. And in Tennessee, dual enrollment is also a big deal, and it's a big part of career and technical education. There's financing for students to take college level classes while they're still in high school. They have a grant that covers at least 4 classes a year. And dual enrollment is part of 2-year school's funding formula. So Tennessee has an outcome-based funding formula, and recognizing that dual enrollment is part of the 2-year school's mission, kind of the number of dual enrolled students that a community college is serving in a given year is part of their funding formula. And okay, so turning to results of kind of what I reported in this brief is that the percent of CTE concentrators who are getting a college credential prior to finishing high school, and the majority of those are getting post-secondary certificates, which can be completed in 1 to 2 years from community colleges. So that's where community colleges are coming into this. The percent was really small. It's a very small share of CTE concentrators in these cohorts. And also, like, access to or the frequency of this outcome happening was very uneven across the state. That's kind of depicted in the map here. It was more common in some of the kind of rural parts of the state, rural central parts of the state, than in other parts of the state. And access was also really uneven by CTE programs. So some CTE programs had a lot more kind of certificate completion and community college enrollment than others. And in the brief, I kind of made the case that there were some advantages to selecting this as a program quality indicator because it's independently verified. You can find out what these credential completion rates are from the college systems in the state, and it's not possible to kind of game these credential completion indicators. So they're independently verified, and that's convenient. But access was really uneven at the time, and the college credential attainment was kind of already part of the state's ready graduate framework, and so it was a little redundant in that sense. And the state ended up choosing work-based learning as its credential, as its additional reported program quality indicator. But as part of this brief, I did put together some very simple statistics on kind of college going and earnings after college for students who graduated high school with a post-secondary certificate, often provided by a community college, versus other CTE concentrators who did not. And those differences were interesting, they're intriguing, and they kind of motivate further study. So, class of 2016 CTE concentrators who left high school with a certificate or an industry certification, but it was mostly post-secondary certificates, they were much more likely to go on to college, driven by a higher likelihood of enrolling in one of the technical colleges in Tennessee. And if they didn't go on to college, they did have higher earnings if they kind of went into the workforce with one of these kind of post-secondary credentials. So those results are kind of descriptive. I don't even think they are regression adjusted in this brief, and there's just a lot more to learn in this space. So high school students, as Lori mentioned, now account for about 1/5 of community college students. That's CCRC reporting that, and this screenshot is from a data dashboard on their site that I encourage you to check out if you're interested in this topic. What they're showing, if you look at the figure closest to me, this is kind of enrollment among students under 18 by higher ed sector, and that top blue line that's just absolutely shooting up is community colleges. Whereas enrollment in community colleges among 18 to 24-year-old students has this kind of cap shape in the middle figure and is steeply declining among students age 25 plus in the last figure. And evidence is really mixed on the effectiveness of dual credit, dual enrollment, advanced placement, and other vehicles that bring college level rigor to high school students. You can see a recent review by Donarski et al. On kind of non-financial interventions in higher education for some of that research. Okay, turning next to a different function of community colleges and a different study, I wanted to say a few words about this paper that I wrote with Thomas Sanford. We started this paper when he was a researcher at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, and we wanted to understand the kind of returns to enrolling in a kind of technical college program as a mid-career adult. And I need to acknowledge up front that this is focused on something, a higher ed sector that is different in important ways from community colleges, but has some important overlap too. So this study is focused on Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. In Tennessee, there are 27 of them. They were located around the state in a way that was intended to, it was intended such that you're never more than 50 miles away from a TCAT. And they offer certificate and diploma. The diplomas are called long-term certificates in other state programs. The community colleges also offer the same certificate and diploma programs. They have very high completion rates. They have very high job placement rates. They work closely with the state labor department in kind of helping displaced or jobless workers get new skills, new training, and move into new jobs. The typical TCAT student is older. They are part-time. And the TCAT experience, just day to day, looks a lot more like work than school. You kind of go in for a set number of hours. You have kind of the same cohort around you, the same instructors around you. A lot of the work is kind of more applied and kind of hands-on and in the same place, rather than kind of moving from class to class and making out a schedule and so on and so forth. Okay, so we want to understand for students who enroll in a TCAT oftentimes after losing their job, does that enrollment pay off later on in terms of higher earnings or a new industry? And to answer this question, we obtained data on all 2004 to 2008 TCAT entrants. We match these data to earnings that are, in firms and occupations that are in the state of Tennessee and covered by unemployment insurance, and match those earnings through 2012. And we added a random selection of 250,000 Tennessee workers, not all of which, very few of which, in fact, ever enrolled in a TCAT, a community college, or a university. We'll see where they come into the research design. So in order to evaluate the returns to enrolling in TCATs, we kind of pursued two different blended strategies. First, in kind of a academic terminology, we estimated a two-way fixed effects model or a student fixed effects model. And in less academic terminology, what that means is that we compared a student's post-TCAT earnings to their pre-TCAT earnings, and we adjusted and controlled for some other things that we knew about those students that would have been related to earnings. And we also pursued a matching strategy where we kind of paired up TCAT students with some of those random selection of 250,000 Tennessee workers who did not enroll in higher education in this time period, but had experienced a similar drop in earnings or employment to see if the TCAT student kind of bounced back higher or further or quicker than the non-student. And one of the first things we found was that new TCAT students tended to enroll after a really steep decline in employment and earnings. This is depicting something that the literature often calls an Ashenfelter's dip. You're really seeing the dip in action here. The likelihood of employment, the value of earnings falls very far and very steeply shortly before enrollment, and then kind of bounces back up after enrollment. And the Ashenfelter's dip looks different depending on whether students ultimately completed a credential. So following some of the related literature on community colleges, we found that students who enrolled and completed a certificate or a diploma tended to do well relative to students who enrolled but did not complete a certificate or diploma. So that comparison is important. It's limited to students, and it's kind of making inferences about their returns to college in terms of whether or not you finished or not. So we're kind of testing the hypothesis that students who completed these programs, got more education, and so we can estimate the effect of that additional education in terms of later earnings. Certificate completers whose kind of late pre and post earnings are depicted in the top figure, their earnings were not significantly different post TCAT enrollment. Certificate programs are shorter, and that's consistent with what the other literature had found for community college students. Diploma completers, on the other hand, depicted in the bottom figure, had lower earnings for a short amount of time, that's when they're enrolled, and then significantly higher earnings up to 3-4 years later. They were a lot more likely to be employed, and they were earning 17% more. That's about $1,000 a quarter. But what we really wanted to understand, like if we were advising a displaced worker, like should you enroll in a TCAT, and if I brought the previous set of results to them and said, well, if you complete a certificate, you'll be better off than if you don't complete. Well, that's not really the decision that they're facing. They're trying to decide whether or not to enroll in college, whether or not to go back to school. So to help address that question, we have paired TCAT students with non-students and statistically tracked their earnings before and after what was usually a pretty steep job loss. And we found in that case that certificate completers were a little bit more likely to be employed post-TCAT. Their earnings were, I don't think I have it on here. Diploma completers were 9 percentage points more likely to be working, and they were earning about 14% more, or $707 more a quarter relative to the matched kind of non-student. Actually, I do have it here. The diploma completers in the bottom figure, they're tracing out that kind of the trend that dips further and then climbs higher. And the certificate completers, their kind of post-enrollment earnings were more similar to students who enrolled but did not complete in a TCAT. But nevertheless, non-completers also had significantly higher earnings than the non-students. Okay, so turning to another function of community colleges, I want to say a little bit about the role of serving new high school graduates who are degree seeking. And in order to kind of study that question, we ideally would like kind of a circumstance where a lot of students kind of enroll in community college who would not have otherwise done so. And Tennessee offered us that circumstance. And by kind of introducing a tuition-free community college program that grew from a small local one-county program, which we're studying here in this paper, to a statewide program that we're studying in follow-up work that I may not have time to say much about, but we can talk about later. So this is a few select insights from a new study that just got accepted at an economics journal on the estimated effects of tuition-free community college on the likelihood that eligible students complete college and their earnings up to 9 years after high school. So in an earlier paper, Bill Fox and I found that access to free community college through a program called Knox Achieves, that's Knox County depicted right there, raised the likelihood that high school graduates went to college by about 2-3 percentage points. And so here, in this follow-on paper, we're testing for longer-term effects on college completion and earning several years after high school. So free community college is, at a kind of cresting, maybe rising wave in the United States right now. Between 2014 and 2022, over 20 states introduced so-called promise programs. The promise is to cover tuition, which pays for college tuition outright or covers the gap between tuition and other grants. It's the difference between a first dollar scholarship and a last dollar scholarship. We talked about this a little bit in a class earlier today with students. So a first dollar promise program will just award you the grant of tuition or grant you the full amount of tuition and fees. A last dollar program kind of waits to see how much aid you get from other sources, need-based Pell Grants, merit-based Hope Scholarships, and so forth, and then pays for any additional funds, any additional balance that's left over, so they cover the last dollar. Last dollar scholarship programs are much lower cost, and they have been, in part because of that, they've been more common in this kind of a wave of promise programs. Many of these programs resembled Knox Achieves, which is what we're studying in this paper, which was introduced for the class of 2009 and then expanded through 2014 and then replicated statewide as Tennessee Promise in 2015. There is no income criteria, there's no ACT criteria, high school GPA, or residency requirement for this program. If you are a high income of low GPA student who just moved to Tennessee last year, you can qualify for free community college tuition in the state through Knox Achieves and through its successor programs. Signing up is really easy. Students kind of signal their interest in the fall of the 12th grade year, and then kind of staff follow up with them later to see if they want to start kind of completing the requirements. One requirement that's important is to file for federal financial aid, Pell Grants, and other sources of aid. So to study this program, we collected data on all Tennessee public high school 12th graders from the classes of 2007 to 2011 and matched that to their records of in-state college completion and UI earnings. And our methods in kind of a non-technical sense are to compare the eligible cohorts in, going back here, the eligible cohorts in the Orange County in 2009 to 2011 to college outcomes for students who graduated a little bit before the program was implemented. 2007 and 2008 is the earliest we can get data on. And then, so that would tell us how much college completion increased for Knox County high school graduates, right? But other things might have been happening around the same time. And so we net from that increase the change in college completion and other outcomes for the rest of the state. So it's a difference in difference type of identification. And turning to results, what we find is there's no significant effect on the likelihood that students complete post-secondary certificates if they're eligible for Knox Achieves. Although we do find some evidence you can read about in the paper that students are more likely to complete certificates on the way to other degrees, but they're not more or less likely to complete a certificate and nothing else. That's what I mean by certificate high completion here. They were 1 percentage point more likely to finish an associate's degree, not more or less likely to finish a bachelor's degree, and that's important because one kind of risk of tuition-free community college is that it could kind of divert students from a 4-year school to starting at a 2-year school and taking their chances with the transfer route. But as we and others have shown, the transfer route is really, really difficult and sets them up for kind of a lot of time and effort kind of navigating that and making sure they get the right classes. We also find inconclusive effects on earnings after college, consistent with other research on kind of different financial aid vehicles, both promise-like financial aid, need-based financial aid, and merit-based financial aid. Studies are kind of consistently finding that when we look to see if there's any significant effect on unemployment insurance covered type of earnings, 10 years after college, it's inconclusive and really hard to detect significant effects. So I'll just say a few words on this. This work is in progress, so we'll kind of leave it there. The single county program grew after 2011. It expanded to cover over 20 counties, including Shelby County, one of the most populous in the state that has Memphis. And then it expanded again to include Davidson County, which has Nashville, and then expanded statewide under the name Tennessee Promise. And so we want to study of that phased in program to see if it had a similar effect on college completion now that we're several years after the 2015 implementation. We got some early signs that there was a lot of interest, a lot of public support for Tennessee Promise. The figure furthest from me is showing several dozen students lining up, hundreds, okay, the tweet says, hundreds of students lining up for more information about Tennessee Promise outside Motlow College. And we got more early indications that Tennessee Promise kind of changed the decisions that students were making about college from an annual kind of report that the state was putting out on Tennessee Promise. Just the 2021 annual Tennessee Promise report is the most recent one that I got this figure from. We found that a lot more students were filing FAFSAs. That's the top figure. So they're filing for federal financial aid. They're planning for college. And there was a significant increase from 59% to 64% of the share of high school students who were going straight to college. And that kind of bump up hadn't been seen in the many years before that are off the screen at which they had been kind of collecting data. You can also go look at iPads and other kind of publicly available data sources, and you can detect, this is eyeball econometrics right here, this dashed line depicting community college enrollment among first-time, full-time freshmen. This absolutely leaps up in 2015 in Tennessee. You can see a little tick downward in university enrollment and a corresponding tick upward. It's large in relative terms, but it's a little bit harder to see in the figure in TCAT enrollment because students could use Tennessee Promise at TCATs as well. In the American Community Survey, also publicly available, you can find more young people reporting that they're in school in 2015, young people who are high school graduates. And that bump up in college going kind of corresponds somewhat with the phase in from one county program to the statewide program. So in the figure furthest from me, the dashed line is depicting the high school graduate college going rate for kind of early adopters of what eventually became Tennessee Promise. So this is in the nonprofit phase of the program. And the line starts to tick upwards around the time that the program was expanding from one county to over 20. And the solid line is kind of depicting college going in counties that did not have a prior Tennessee Achieves or AIRS, was another nonprofit in this space in the state. And that college going rate shoots up right at 2015, corresponding with the introduction of statewide Tennessee Promise. Okay, so we have more to do there, but all of that is very green. So here are my takeaways. Community colleges do more with less. Research by myself and others finds support for each broad community college function, dual enrollment, degree-seeking enrollment, and career-focused enrollment or reskilling, but there are asterisks. So there are mixed results for dual high school community college enrollment, and a lot less is known about the latest surge in dual enrollment. So that $1 million fewer community college student figure that I showed from the National Student Clearinghouse is supported somewhat by a growing number of dual enrolled students. And if you take them out of the equation, community college enrollment has fallen even further. Regarding the transfer pathway, there are significant red flags about how functional that is, and more to learn about where that is functional and how it can be. And then in terms of career-focused education, there's a fairly large literature showing that kind of enrolling in community college with the intention of kind of moving on to, or with the intention of obtaining some kind of job-ready skills is effective, and community colleges serve that role well. But this effectiveness relative to some newer kind of firm-based education developments, kind of credentialing and badges and on-the-job training is less clear. So that's an area for future research and future policy work. And going forward, I want to implore everyone when we're kind of thinking about community colleges and evaluating community colleges in your kind of specific research questions and in your specific policy context to also be mindful of what the counterfactual is. What someone would be doing if they were not enrolled in a community college is what I mean by that. So would they be out of college? Would they be taking up on-the-job credentialing? Would they be at an institution with kind of a more focused mission? Or would they be in a better resourced four-year schools? I think that counterfactual is important for delving into kind of these critical comparisons of community colleges and other institutions. So I will stop there and welcome your questions.
I have two questions. The first question is, you gave a lot of statistics on certificates and degrees and the difference in income between those two. Did you look at the combination? Because I work in the College of Engineering here, and we are certainly encouraging our students to receive certificates in a variety of areas to boost their employability. So did you happen to look at what the income differential was for both certificates and an associate's degree?
Okay. So in the report you're referring to, we were using like American Community Survey or current population survey data, and so they don't tell us kind of the full history of a student's kind of educational attainment. So we weren't looking at kind of stacked credentials in that context. But I have not myself kind of looked at like the income differences with a stacked credential versus you just kind of one and done type of completion, but I know that others have.
Okay, just curious. My second question and final one is, many community colleges like Dallas College are now starting to offer bachelor's degrees in very high demand areas like in education. Has there been any research, or have you done any research on the completion of students basically community college students and getting those bachelor's degrees?
No, I think that's a kind of terrific open or nearly open area of research. I know kind of Riley Acton, who's an education policy scholar that and everyone should follow if you're interested in community colleges, has kind of studied the effect of kind of name changes, moving from such and such community college to college, for example, and things like that. But yeah, I think this is a fascinating area for additional work because one wonders if kind of part of the challenge of navigating the 2 to 4 year transfer pathway is that you have to change institutions. You have to, I was talking about this earlier today, you have to kind of find where all the different admin offices that you need to visit are. You have to kind of understand their schedules and their habits and their rules and you have to like repeat all of that when you change institutions. We know in K-12 education research that changing schools is disruptive, and in terms of achievement, it kind of decreases student progress. And so it's reasonable to assume that the same thing is happening with student transfer. And so circumstances where students can kind of transfer to a bachelor's pathway but without leaving the institution are really interesting to study.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Savannah Sanders, and I am recently employed here with A&M. I worked at Tyler Junior College about 5 years in East Texas. I was a advisor for a bit, and then also I ended up being the one that changed the majors for the school, so I was like the major change coordinator, essentially. And so my question kind of bounces off the last one there, where have any of these really taken into account students that initially say they want to transfer, say they want to be like teachers, and then maybe a semester or year goes by and they're like, well, I actually want to be a nurse, and then they go and get their RN or even LVN and could potentially make a lot more that way than like a BA or BS, like essentially changing to a trade opposed to maybe just a regular like AA or AS, if that makes sense, like an AAS.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point and a really good question. So the statistic where like 4 out of 5 community college students kind of aspire to earn a bachelor's degree, that's national, but we've seen kind of similar among high school student survey results in Tennessee. And so the question is like, well, people can kind of change their minds and they can kind of see their cohorts taking a different type of class or maybe taking nursing and think, I'd like to move into that. I think that's also really interesting and definitely should be studied more. What's challenging in like a statewide type of data system where I've done some of this work is that we don't see a lot of granular detail on like the type of classes that students are taking. That might be here in the ERC, possibly. And so it's a little bit harder to track those subtle shifts. We can see big major changes, like changing from the liberal arts transfer major into kind of a more specific program or something like that. The causal research on kind of the effect of enrolling in a community college on later BA completion and later earnings would take that into account only kind of on net. And so we might conclude that, starting at a community college has kind of starting at a community college rather than a four-year school, if that significantly lowers earnings later on, or if that has no significant effect on earnings later on, we wouldn't necessarily be able to unpack all of the different mechanisms that are happening there, and that's certainly one part of it. I spoke with several transfer advisors in a kind of qualitative research project last year that we haven't written up yet, and I heard a little bit about exactly this type of shift. So you get into college and you're kind of taking your general education classes, and the nursing classes and the applied classes, they look really interesting because they're different. They're unlike anything that you've ever taken before. And so that kind of a diversity of offerings there can kind of attract some students away from what they would have originally reported as being their degree intentions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diego Rodriguez. And have you seen any, or maybe how many schools in Tennessee or across the U.S. have a community college, four-year university dual enrollment program? I mean, you talked about the high school one. I've been at A&M for over a year, but I ran a bunch of different programs at NASA for 10 years, and I created a community college program with a four-year university, pathways into employment into the federal government. And the success rate was really high. So have you seen any of that? And the second question is, do you know if the federal government is providing any funding or support to create kind of the dual enrollment between community colleges and 4 years?
So first, clarifying on my end, are you talking about kind of dual admission transfer programs? Yes, okay, nodding. So a dual admission transfer program where you kind of get admitted to the two-year school and the four-year school at the same time, and that makes it significantly easier to transfer those credits. So you're a little bit less likely to take a class that doesn't end up transferring. It's a kind of even more formal system of articulation agreements between kind of a web of different two-year and four-year schools. Tennessee does have a number of dual enrollment transfer agreements and arrangements. And I don't want to misrepresent her, but I believe there's someone at kind of Vanderbilt who is studying those in Tennessee or someone else or somewhere else. We would like to study the articulation agreement system that emerged in Tennessee. It's different from the dual enrollment transfer program where you get admitted to the two different institutions at the same time. But we would like to study the emergence of the Tennessee transfer pathways, which was implemented in 2011. But it's just kind of challenging because that was at the very early phases of kind of the data collection efforts in the state. But we would like to study that because the kind of cohorts that we were studying in the Knox Achieves and the Free Community College program, the very tail end of that cohort would have been kind of graduating high school when those transfer pathways were implemented. And it would be interesting to see if some of the kind of bachelor's and four-year college outcomes that we're studying in this context might have changed for those cohorts that had exposure to tuition-free community college as well as the transfer pathways.
Hi, I'm Ed Bassett. I'm a director for engineering academies here at A&M. And so the engineering academies, we are a true co-enrollment program. So what we have is, as you kind of described, students are enrolled at A&M, they're Aggies from day one, and enrolled at soon to be 9 community colleges across the state. So they're, Aggies from day one. Yay, whoop. And what we have found in doing that, a couple of things that we did, just for your knowledge. We did find, just like the national average was, once the students get enrolled in college, and specifically College of Engineering, after their first year, 70% of them are changing their majors. which kind of corresponds to what happens when students are transferring also from community colleges. So the College of Engineering implemented general engineering, which then opened up the pathway for us to allow a professor from A&M to be on site at those community colleges. So I have 9 professors at each one of those colleges. So they are taught the general engineering course on site, and they take their core courses from the community college. So there's no transfer pathway involved. They're already in Aggie. The success rates have been phenomenal. Our retentions are in the high 80%, and our graduation rates have been twofold. One is the graduation rate has equaled what the graduation rate is directly here at College Station. So they're graduating, it's engineering, so they're graduating within 5 years, all of the students. And also they're graduating with, which I found fantastic, with the same or better GPA. And that part of that is, to your point, part of the program requires the student to complete, because it's engineering, the math skills, if you will, their math curriculums at the community college. So Calc 1, Calc 2, Calc 3, so then you don't get behind once you've actually transferred in. Or in this case, transitioned, not transferred. Some of the difficulties we've had with the program has been with the community colleges, because the state of Texas doesn't have free tuition at the community colleges. So have you found, if you've looked nationally, and I was very interested in Tennessee, and I knew that my parents live in Tennessee, and so I knew they had offered the free tuition. Have you found nationally any correlation between like GPAs or completion rates when they had like a free tuition at community college?
I haven't looked at that. Well, there's a lot there I wanted to reflect on. A couple things. I think the general engineering part is really interesting. So if I understand that right, that does allow for some flexibility for students to change their specialization. Is that right? Okay. I think that's really important. That's like a luxury that four-year students have that is a lot harder to do at to your school without kind of wasting time, credits, and hours. I will definitely cop to changing my major several times. And if anyone else wants to cop to that, feel free to. Oh, okay. All right, great. So that's really a luxury that's easier if you stay in one school, or if you have the flexibility to maneuver around within a broad field, for sure. But in terms of your question, so the question is like, are tuition-free community college programs kind of associated with student outcomes like GPA, like college completion? What I've been doing on this question is just kind of studying one program at a time, specifically Tennessee Promise, because the programs are so different from one context to another, and they're different in ways that I think kind of reflect what the states value or what they want to see more of. And so some states want to see like more people staying in state, and so they integrate these stay or pay provisions. I'm not going to name any states in particular, but I think we know who they are. Where if you kind of leave the state, you have to pay back your promised scholarship. Others want to see more employment in specific fields, and so they limit the benefits to like majoring in those fields. So it's going to be challenging. I'd really love to see like more kind of nationwide studies that unpack the effectiveness of these different elements, but I think that they will have to take into account the variety of different eligibility kind of populations and benefits that are there. But Tennessee Promise was a big kind of splashy implementation in the state in 2015, and at the same time they introduced kind of a free tuition and technical college program for adults age 25 and older. And it's just grown kind of since then with additional kind of nonprofit add-ons to support kind of groceries, gas expenses, emergency grants, and things like that. More to learn.
Thank you, Celeste, for your talk. I also have a question about the free tuition community college program. Can you talk a little bit more about like what's the reason behind your study and other studies not finding much link between free tuition and labor market outcomes? Because I'm curious, like, it's great that you find associate degree attainment increased after implementing this policy, but is that good enough if we don't see labor market outcomes afterwards, or are you leaving that up to policymakers to decide?
Yeah, I agree. So this is a little bit of a puzzle we haven't quite unwrapped yet. So we are kind of finding that kind of access to tuition-free community college significantly increases associate's degree receipt, doesn't appear to have a significant positive or negative effect on bachelor's degree receipt. But I mean, scale is kind of important here, maybe. So the effect on associate's degrees is like 1 percentage point of a high school class additionally have an associate's degree within 9 years. And so that's a large fraction of the kind of typical share of a high school class that has an associate's degree within 9 years. I think it's about a third. But if we're looking for kind of returns to education via this policy that increased educational attainment for students, we would be looking for, based on other literatures, up to like 20% additional earnings. That's the like returns to college upper limit by age 30 that others have found in really clean causal quasi-experimental settings. So we would be looking for 20% additional earnings among 1 percentage point or less of the student population. So that's one possible explanation, is just that the kind of scale of these programs is not enough to move the aggregate needle in such a way. It's also like when we project out the additional earnings that we would expect people who have additional associate's degrees and with no change in bachelor's degrees, when we project out those earnings based on census data that we have for people with different levels of education and compare them to the cost of the program, which like per eligible student per year is like under $250, the social returns are like very, very positive, wildly positive. But it's puzzling that we aren't yet seeing significant returns in individual student earnings. It's also maybe not enough time. I mean, 10 years after high school, 9 years after high school, I feel like that's a long time, and we're done with the study. We're not longitudinally refreshing the data again. But since we saw the associate's degree receipt, we didn't really see it emerge until, I want to say, 4 or 5 years after high school. That's when the significant gain in associate's degree receipt was kind of precise enough to rest our hats on. It's possible that 9 years after high school is like still not enough time for the returns to education to have accumulated high enough to detect.
I have a couple of questions regarding funding, and I don't know if this is part of your research as well, but I was educated in California in the 80s, and they at that time had free funding for community colleges. And have you used any research from that era? Because to my understanding, they don't have it anymore, and it's bankrupt. So I assumed that Tennessee doesn't have a state income tax. I don't know. We don't here. So California is highly taxed. So I just wondered if you could speak to those issues.
Yeah. So when I give a full-length talk that just focuses on kind of free community college, I always mention California, because the master plan for education was to kind of make college tuition free, and especially community colleges tuition free for the whole state. And then like it worked, but kind of required fees started to kind of erode into that purpose like over time. So Tennessee, likes to say that they're the first in the nation offering free community college, but that's kind of with an asterisk behind that. So I refer to California as part of the context, but I haven't specifically studied kind of the evolution of students and workforces before and after the master plan for education changed.
What's your take on the Biden administration's proposals to push free community college tuition? Is this a scalable thing? Should we expect the same kind of outcomes nationally that you saw in Tennessee?
That's difficult. So let's see. there have been a couple different waves of federal proposals for tuition-free community college. There was America's College Promise under President Obama. Obama actually came to Knoxville to, propose this policy, kind of on the heels of the, widespread love for Tennessee Promise. Some of our graduate students actually got to drive big black SUVs in the motorcade. It was exciting times. And then the Biden administration, there was the tuition-free community college aspect of some of the legislation that they've put forward. And neither of those kind of went much further than the proposal stage. And in the meantime, what's happened is like more and more states have introduced their own versions of these, and they're all subtly different in ways that I can read through the eligibility and the benefit criteria and see that states value kind of different aspects of this. What was a little troubling about the Biden proposal to me was that programs like Tennessee Promise would not have counted towards that. It involved a state match in terms of financial aid, and so some of the work that states had already done to make college lower cost would not have counted. So the state of Tennessee would have had to go back and kind of remake how Tennessee Promise was organized in order to kind of participate in the state match problem. And I'm not a political scientist, many of you are, and you can probably speak to this better than I can, but I'm just not. I see troubled waters with 20 plus states kind of revising their programs to fit a kind of federal state match going forward. Had it launched and been implemented, would it have had the same effects? As, again, I think it's important to think about what the counterfactual is, like doubling Pell Grants so that or increasing Pell Grants so that more states can implement their own kind of versions of tuition-free college that kind of rely on other kind of federal sources of financial aid. I am not sure if it would be kind of more or less effective than that, so long as the program could attach the free college message. I think that it could be pivotal, because some of my own research, which I didn't mention here, has found that complicated grant programs like the Pell Grant don't really move the needle in terms of whether or not students go to college, but there's something about the free college message that came with Tennessee Promise and the programs before it that really did change student behavior, even though the programs themselves did not involve a lot of scholarship money. So possibly a federal program that made good on the free college promise or allowed states to do so would have similar effects.
Will you all join me in thanking